It is Friday, February 23rd, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is Wallace Smith. I'm your host today. Regrettably, my co-host is not here today, Mr. John Robinson. He is serving elsewhere in the country. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but I hope he is having a fantastic time. But we do still have a podcast to do this week. And this one in particular really grabbed my attention as I was going through some old stuff. I randomly came across it, an article I had saved for myself 8 years ago or so. And the title just jumped out at me, and I realized, wow, I do want to talk about this, and I do think it'll be profitable for you. So our topic today is an atheist's confession of blind faith. Let's jump into it after the musical break. Thank you, as always, Jake and Julia, for our little intro music, and welcome again to the podcast. So it is correct. I am here by myself. As sad as that makes you, it makes me sadder. Mr. John Robinson is off in Wisconsin serving at the family weekend there in Merrill with Mr. Sandor and his family, Mr. Robinson and his wife. Anyway, I hope they are having a fantastic time. If anyone there is listening to this, I hope you're all having a fantastic time. We definitely enjoyed our time at the family weekend. Wow, what was that, 2 or 3 years ago? I can't recall. It really was a hoot. And by the way, for those who don't know such idioms, a hoot is a good thing. We really enjoyed it, and we just pray all of you have a wonderful time. The Bible study goes well, the services, whatever you're doing as activities. I know there was a lot of snow there the time we went, and there was a lot of sledding and such going on. Anyway, you guys have a good time, and we miss you, Mr. Robinson. If you happen to be listening to this, look forward to you coming back. In lieu of doing a podcast with him, a lot of ideas crossed our mind. One, it didn't even come together in my mind that we would do it this way. We were hoping to get one recorded yesterday, but honestly, it has just been one of those weeks. It's like it's one thing after another. I'm actually sitting in Mr. Robinson's office right now with a whole bunch of empty cardboard boxes to my left and some on the wall there. There's been TWPs going on. Headquarters is a busy, busy place. And so we had hoped to record one yesterday before he left. Was it yesterday? No, day before yesterday. And we just were not able to pull it off. So here we are with Lonely Me. I was thinking of doing a 5 questions with someone here in the office, but I hadn't actually talked to anybody ahead of time and prepped for that. And I thought, you know what? We're just going to do a podcast. So then I could do it by asking Mr. Robinson questions and sitting in silence as we all imagine what he might say. But that would be a very weird podcast. So we're not going to do that. It's just going to be me going over this particular article that I do think you will enjoy or at least get something out of. I know that I got things out of it, even though it may not be what the author intended. This article comes from The Guardian. That is a UK newspaper and website, and it tends to lean definitely in a more liberal political direction, I would say, versus some other papers you can get out of the UK. But still, it doesn't mean it's not necessarily terrible reporting, and it doesn't mean it's necessarily terrible reporting. And this particular article, I had saved for myself, I think 8 years ago or so. I know the article is at least 8 years old, and it's by, it's a young woman named Ijeoma Oluo. And she is an atheist, as she will make very plain in her title. I'm going to do my best to read some parts of her article from that time without commenting too much. I'm going to have to comment here and there, but the points I want to build on that, it'd be easier to build after I read this. And first, why do I do this? Why are we going to talk about this? Well, it'll be more clear after we go through the parts of the article. But not only will each of you, young people here listening in the audience, you teens and young adults, you'll be encountering people of various different belief statuses, if you will, but also increasingly a number of atheists, those who declare there is no God. And there's various opinions out there about such things, including what it means to have faith to begin with. And at the heart of what interests me in this article is what it means to have faith. That's not going to be our focus today in the broader picture, but I will point you to a resource we have in the Living Church News I find very helpful. But let's just jump into the article and let me grab what she has to say, Miss Oluo, and then let's talk about it. So her title says, "My Atheism does not make me superior to believers. It's a leap of faith too. Now that might catch you off guard, an atheist talking about actually having a faith of some sort. In fact, this is me commenting, by the way, this is not the article. Even on the telecast here and there, sometimes we'll make comments in sermons and other things talking about how atheism is in its own way a kind of faith and a kind of religion, which of course would just infuriate most atheists. But when you look at the fundamentals of faith and belief and frankly religion, you do see a lot of that in even atheism. And by the way, I guess I should say here at the beginning, what is atheism? Well, this article gets into a little bit of that, even though the author didn't seem to intend to, because people will define atheism differently in subtle ways. Some will define atheism as a lack of belief in God. And they try to do that. They try to use those exact words because they're trying to make a point for the sake of argumentation. And definitely atheists don't believe there is a God, but it's also true that they believe there is no God. It's a positive assertion. An atheist is someone who does not believe that God exists or who believes that there is no God. Some try to make a fine distinction between those two things because they want to say that the burden of proof is on you if you believe that there is a God, but they have no burden of proof because they're not believing in anything. When the fact is, any kind of truth statement needs to be able to be backed up. Someone bears a burden for backing that up. For them to say there is no God or there is a God, I'm sorry, that is an assertion that must be backed up. There's no word weaseling that can get you out of having to defend your position. And one thing I appreciate about this article, and by the way, there's a lot I don't appreciate about it. I'm not endorsing the article as I read it. I'm just setting the stage, is that at least Miss Oluo doesn't seem to try to finesse that point. Maybe she does in other writings. I have no idea. But in this case, she's just straight up. She believes there's no God, and that is her conviction. But then she talks about that. And she talks about the role that she believes faith, as she calls it, plays into it. In fact, the summary, I don't know that she wrote it here, but the little summary of the article says, it's easy to look at terror, as in terrorism, done in the names of different gods, and think, look at those foolish religious folk. But we, speaking to atheists, we're in no position to cast the first stone. So let me get into and just read parts of her article here. Again, what was the title of the article? It was, My Atheism Does Not Make Me Superior to Believers. It's a Leap of Faith too. All right, here we go. She writes here at the very beginning, there are many different ways in which people come to atheism. Many come to it in their early adult years, after a childhood in the church, I would say a church. Some are raised in atheism by atheist parents. Some come to atheism after years of religious study. I came to atheism the way that many Christians come to Christianity, through faith. Now, I have a problem with her calling this faith, but we'll talk about that later. But let me do highlight for here at the beginning. I said I wouldn't editorialize. You know I'm going to editorialize. I've known atheists who were raised as atheists. It'd be unthinkable, say 40 years or so ago. But I remember a young woman I worked with, very nice young woman in general, how she was an atheist herself. And she was reared to be an atheist by her parents. So it wasn't like some sort of hip conclusion she came to later. She was actually raised, if you will, quote unquote, in that faith. So in her case, though, the author of this article, she says she supposedly came to atheism through faith. Now, this is what she thinks of as faith. Let her explain it. She continues in the article. I was 6 years old, she says, sitting in my frilly yellow Easter dress, throwing black jelly beans out into the yard. I actually love that picture personally. She says, when my mom explained the story of Easter to me. Now, by the way, clearly she doesn't understand even a modicum of the truth, but this is what you would hear from most mainstream Christians concerning Easter. She says she explained Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection as the Son of God, going into great detail. And when she was finished telling me the story that had been a foundation of her faith for the majority of her life, I looked at her and said, I don't think that really happened. Now, she's 6 years old, and this is her concluding at 6, I don't think that really happened. Now, continue with her. She's not trying to paint a picture of herself as a super logical 6-year-old necessarily. She continues, I didn't come to this conclusion because the story of a man waking from the dead made no sense. I wasn't an overly analytical child. I still enthusiastically believed in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. But when I searched myself for any sense of belief in a higher power, it just wasn't there. I wanted it to be there. How comforting to have a God. But it wasn't there, and it isn't to this day. Now, it really is interesting. It's how she puts this. She says she didn't come to this conclusion because it didn't make any sense. She was open to things that didn't make sense. She enthusiastically believed in Santa Claus, a guy that slides down the chimney and brings you presents. She said she enthusiastically believed in the Easter Bunny, a bunny that hops around laying eggs and all the rest. But she says it wasn't that it didn't make sense. She just, and here's where I think this is a bit of a stretch. When I searched myself, she writes, for any sense of belief in a higher power, it just wasn't there. I'd like to give her some credit that she means search herself in the way that a 6-year-old would search herself, which is not going to be very deeply. She clearly didn't seem to search herself for any sense that a man could wedge himself down through the chimney for every chimney of every quote-unquote Christian kid in the entire world, let alone a bunny hopping around laying eggs. I don't know that she searched herself. I think that was a bit of a stretch. But regardless, what she's trying to say is that was her naive, untutored 6-year-old reaction. Was like, yeah, I don't think that happened. Yeah, I believe in Santa Claus. I believe in the Easter Bunny, but I don't really believe that guy came from the dead. So here's the thing. She essentially claims that is an act of faith. Like this child is just expressing some kind of faith. And that somehow this is the same kind of faith that people who do believe in God and believe in Jesus Christ actually do have. She continues, let's see, jump a little bit further down. She says, but my conviction that there is no God is nonetheless a leap of faith. Just as we have been unable to prove there is a God, we have also been unable to prove that there isn't one. The feeling that I have in my being that there is no God is what I go by. But I'm not deluded into thinking that feeling is in any way more factual than the deep conviction by theists, that is those who believe in God, that God exists. Let me pause here because, again, I do want to context. I mean, I said I wouldn't editorialize, but again, I cannot help myself before we get there. First, she does say that her conviction is that there's no God, that she feels she has a positive conviction there is no God. It's not just that she fails to believe in one, but rather she is convicted there is not one. So I'll at least give her that. A lot of popular atheists today, they just don't like to go that far. They like to try to weasel themselves out of having to prove any kind of sense that, no, I believe this strongly, and here's why. And yet at the same time, there's so much wrong here. She calls it a leap of faith. You could call it a blind faith conclusion, perhaps in some way. We'll come back to the words blind faith. But she says we haven't been able to prove there's a God, but we also haven't been able to prove there isn't one. Well, there's a lot there that's rough in terms of what does it mean to prove something. A lot of people hold this idea of proof as if it's mathematical proof, which, man, I got to admit, I love to a great extent. I love proving things in mathematics. I love proving, how many degrees there are in total for the 3 angles of a triangle. I had on my whiteboard in my office recently, until recently, I need to make more room for other things, but I was just doodling around and did a proof of the Pythagorean theorem, a geometric proof that the square on the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares on the 2 legs of a right triangle. Yeah, I do like that kind of thing. I love that sort of thing. Mr. Robinson talks about wanting to do a podcast where we talk about that kind of thing, and hopefully it wouldn't put everybody to sleep. But that said, yeah, I like proof, but that's not the kind of proof that almost anyone does in real life for real life things. The idea of proof in the world is more like a courtroom kind of proof, where you simply have evidence and you're trying to draw the best conclusion you can that fits the evidence. And so don't let people get you caught up in that trap. Well, you can't prove God exists. Well, what do they mean by proof? Often they hold God's existence to a level of proof that they wouldn't be able to satisfy almost anything in their lives with when they put their own lives on the line for some of those things. You can't prove, this is going to sound like a dumb one, but honestly, it's one that I think of a lot in this context. You can't prove your mother loves you in that sense. What you have is a lot of evidence that your mother loves you, and you draw a right conclusion based on that she loves you. It's not a mathematical proof. And there's so many weird things in the world like that. Like, for instance, if I asked you to prove, this is going to sound dumb and philosophical, but it might be helpful for some of you. If I asked you to prove that the past exists, that you didn't just wake up in this particular moment and that everything in the past is some kind of illusion in some way. Well, how do you actually prove that? You can't. You can't prove that. And yet, it's the right thing to conclude. It's the most reasonable thing to conclude based on all of the evidence, far more reasonable than the alternative that somehow everything that's happened up until this moment is an illusion in our brains. There's so much in the world that we move forward on, not based on some sort of mathematical proof. We just have an abundance of evidence, and we draw the conclusions just like you do in a courtroom where two sides are presenting evidence, but only one tale concerning the explanation of all that evidence is true, and your job is to conclude what that is. And so often when I see things like this, it sounds like it's the atheist who is trying to make some kind of concession, saying, hey, look, I get it. You guys can't prove God exists, but hey, we can't prove he doesn't exist either. Well, they're using a weird definition of proof that doesn't fit the real world. The fact is there is evidence one way or the other. And like in a courtroom, yes, you can draw real conclusions. In fact, as I'll try to say towards the end of the podcast, you have to draw a conclusion. This is something we all have to draw a conclusion on. It's not something we can just sit on the sidelines about. Now, let's continue here in terms of what she says. She says, I keep this fact in mind, that my atheism is a leap of faith, because otherwise it's easy to get cocky. It's easy to look at acts of terror committed in the names of different gods, debates about the role of women in various churches, unfamiliar and elaborate religious rules and rituals, and think, look at these foolish religious folk. It's easy to view religion as the root of society's ills. I will say, yeah, that's true. It's easy for a lot of blind individuals to conclude that, and definitely to see false religion as a source of many of society's ills, but also to see the irreligious as well. And she continues and tries to say that, or at least something like that. Here's what she says. She says, but atheism as a faith is quickly catching up in its embrace of divisive and oppressive attitudes. We have websites dedicated to insulting Islam and Christianity. We have famous atheist thought leaders spouting misogyny and calling for the profiling of Muslims. As a black atheist, I encounter just as much racism amongst other atheists as anywhere else. We have hundreds of thousands of atheists blindly following atheist leaders like Richard Dawkins, hurling insults and even threats at those who dare question them. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of her article because I'd like to move on to important things we need to consider about this article. And let me say, there's so much I would disagree with Miss Oluo concerning this particular article. She is. I actually just looked up her profile here on The Guardian. It says that she's based in Seattle and likes to yell on the internet, apparently. Her work on feminism and social justice has been featured in Time, New York Magazine, Huffington Post, Jezebel, XO Jane, and a whole bunch of other works. Anyway, regardless, yeah, there's a lot I would disagree with. And the morality that comes out of the page is actually fairly presumptive on a lot of different levels. But I appreciate her trying to make an effort to highlight that, yes, as atheists, they too have a kind of faith. They have what at least what she's calling faith, that their view of the world is not completely rooted in as much fact as atheists often like to pretend that it is. So I can appreciate what she's trying to do. At the same time, I can only go so far in terms of appreciating it, because what is it that she's really trying to say? Well, sorry, I need to back that up. It's not what she's trying to say. It's what she takes for granted in what she's trying to say. And here's what I want to highlight to you. It's easy to be tempted by an article like this. And yeah, I doubt that you saw this one 8 years ago. Some of you were 3. Well, not 3. What are the ages of our most? We're trying to go for teens and young adults. So let's say you're 13, you're a new listener, and you go back to when you were 5 and read this article. Well, you probably wouldn't have read this article at 5. But there are articles like this from time to time that look like they're reaching out a hand, where it's an atheist saying, hey, look, I kind of get it. I'm a lot like you in a lot of ways. But there's assumptions that are buried in this that we need to reject and be willing to reject outright, and not get caught up in our feelings of friendship and fellowship to the point that we miss these things. In particular, there's a very specific, dangerous idea in this article that you cannot afford to accept. And frankly, just like young Miss Aluo takes for granted in this, many people take it for granted. And that is that faith is essentially equivalent to what is more accurately called blind faith. That faith is only faith because it has nothing to do with actual evidence and reason and logic at all. And that is simply not the case. In fact, it should be a bit insulting to take what she has said, that the reason you believe in God is essentially the same level of reasoning and thought and rational consideration that she was capable of giving when she was 6 years old, because that is not sufficient. What a child draws as a conclusion at 6 is not enough to build actual faith upon. She confesses herself that she decided, well, Santa Claus was real, the Easter Bunny was real, and Jesus wasn't. Now, of course, I realize this is a short article, an opinion piece. She's not elaborating, but clearly in her life, I would assume for her sake, she came to find evidence that Santa was not real. She came to find evidence that the Easter Bunny was not real. But somehow she thinks that the conclusion that Jesus actually did die and was executed on a stake and rose from the dead is somehow in the exact same category as the childhood beliefs she had that she was able to grow up and toss aside. And it's not. That's a ridiculous conclusion. And yet it's not only the conclusion of many atheists. Here's a point I want to make. It's the conclusion of many worldly Christians as well. There is an entire collection of quote-unquote Christians out there that want you to believe that faith is only faith if there's no real evidence to back it up. In fact, if you're even trying to back up your beliefs with any kind of evidence, then somehow you're betraying what it means to have faith. And that is just ridiculous. And it's more than ridiculous. Frankly, it's dangerous. It's dangerous to think that way. But first, let's highlight just how ridiculous it is. And, it's funny with Mr. Robinson not here, I'm not nearly as prepared on my computer as I normally am. I try to get my Bible up and all sorts of things. So let me go ahead and get that, because we'll definitely look at some verses. First, consider this. For those out there who are trying to say that, well, you know what, if there's evidence, then it's not faith. If you can prove something about it, then there's not faith. Well, we can prove that wrong right out of the gate. Think about it. If faith is impossible, if you start adding evidence to it, well, think of the poor apostles. I mean, literally the 12 apostles. Of course, Judas was kicked out, and then someone else brought in, Matthias, but the 12. Let's talk about the 12. You can throw Paul in there, but let's talk about the 12 in particular for this reason. They had the maximal amount of evidence you could possibly have that Jesus had actually been raised from the dead. They literally saw him with their eyes. They ate with him after his resurrection. He showed Thomas, hey, Thomas, look, here's this hole in my side. You said you had to see. Here are these holes in my hands. They had evidence. They could not deny the evidence of their eyes, frankly, the evidence of their hands, the evidence of their ears. They literally sat in the room with him. He appeared in their midst in a room. They ate fish. He cooked fish for them on the side, on the shore. They were filled with evidence. And so I guess poor apostles, they'll never be able to live by faith. It highlights how ridiculous that is. More than that, you can think of Israel, ancient Israel. Did they have evidence? Yes, they literally walked between two towering walls of water. If that is an evidence that there is a supernatural and powerful God, I don't know what is. So they had, now how do they act on that evidence? We'll get to that when it comes to talking about the fullness of faith, which transcends evidence. But the point here is that faith is not against evidence. And there's a poisonous, false version of Christianity out there that tries to convince you that, no, you add evidence and that's not faith. Consider Abraham even. Abraham is called the father of the faithful for cause. We have physical descendants of Abraham, and that's the basis of our understanding of how prophecy is going to unfold. But spiritual descendants of Abraham includes everyone who's ever been baptized, have been given God's Spirit, and has truly become a follower of Jesus Christ. If you are following in the faith, then you become a child of Abraham in that amazing spiritual sense, as a part of the Israel of God, as it's called in the Bible. And so Abraham is the father of the faithful, and he is praised for his faith. And yet at the same time, if he had to have that faith in the absence of evidence, well, boy, he's in trouble, because he literally spoke with God. God revealed visions to him. God actually talked with him with astonishing intimacy. He visited him before he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. He is actually the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ when you look at all the details, but still a member of the Godhead, the God of the Old Testament. So if somehow it requires you not to have evidence, and we should just shun all evidence and shun trying to prove anything, otherwise it's not faith, well, that's just ridiculous, because the people we look at, like the apostles, like Abraham, they had plenty of evidence. So do not fall for that lie that somehow faith must be blind faith, or else you'll end up tossing aside the truth just as easily as this young woman here eventually, in some point in her life, tossed aside Santa Claus or tossed aside the Easter Bunny. Perhaps I'm assuming in that regard. I do hope that she has by now tossed those aside. Now, it is true that faith goes beyond evidence, and I will get to that in a moment, but it is not against evidence. It is not the same as blind faith or a blind belief in the absence of evidence. And so, yes, I do see atheists claiming this all the time. There's a book I bought some time ago, and the author is popular in a lot of anti-woke circles. He's an atheist. Peter Boghossian, I believe is his name. He was eventually let go by his university because of the steps he did in publishing fake papers to demonstrate that these garbage papers would be published by these nonsense journals. He actually exposed a great truth in that sense, and yet at the same time, he was then eventually, I think, kicked out of faculty for that. Peter Boghossian, but he was very much into the particular science of knowing and how you come to know things. And he wrote a book. I can't recall the title exactly. I think it's called a manual for creating atheists, I think, because he believed in what he called street epistemology. He liked to kind of be the opposite of an apostle or an evangelist for belief in Jesus Christ, and he liked to be kind of an apostle or evangelist for atheism. And he loved confronting quote-unquote Christians on the street and challenging their belief. And frankly, at least based on the tactics he gives, he was probably pretty good at it, because most quote unquote Christians' beliefs are rooted on nonsense, and they're rooted on this kind of blind faith like we're talking about, that some are saying you should have as quote unquote real faith. And so he just tears that kind of stuff apart. But his understanding of faith is that essentially faith is pretending to know something you don't. And that's essentially what this young woman says in her article. Faith is pretending to know something you don't. But that's not the case. That is not what faith is. Faith is larger than evidence, and yet at the same time, it is related to evidence. And if your faith is not grounded in some kind of evidence, well, then that's something you need to take a crack at. So let's actually do take a look at faith and evidence. I'd like to encourage you, because we'll talk about proving the things you know, but I really want to call back to an article by Mr. Gerald Weston in an old Living Church News. It's from the September-October 2017 issue. So not quite 7 years ago, more like 6.5 years ago or so. And the title is Understanding Hebrews 11:1. Chapter 11 and verse 1. Understanding Hebrews 11:1. It's right there on the first page of the Living Church News. It's the part that we in the editorial department refer to as the Dear Brethren letter, because if you've noticed, every single Living Church News starts with a letter to the brethren from the presiding evangelist, Dr. Roderick C. Meredith before him, and now Mr. Gerald Weston. And he tries to make sure that we don't misunderstand Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 in this. And I admit, I think years ago, I probably made this mistake, and I know I've heard the mistake made since, but Mr. Weston sets the record straight. And let me just read portions of his article today. So he starts off by saying, Dear brethren, what is the relationship between faith and evidence? Do you personally know? Are you sure? He says, over the years, I have occasionally heard Hebrews 11 and verse 1 referred to incorrectly. Here is what this famous verse says. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now he continues, because the word evidence is found in this verse, some think it means we have evidence for our faith. But this is not what it says. On the contrary, it says that faith is our evidence, and that is a huge difference. Now, let me pause here to set you up for what he's about to say. He's not trying to say we don't have evidence for the things that we believe. Rather, he's trying to highlight that Hebrews chapter 11 is not saying that. Hebrews 11 verse 1 is saying something far more profound than simply we have evidence for the things we believe. And he wants to make sure that distinction is clear in this article, that he's not trying to say we should have blind faith. That is, we should have a faith that has nothing to do with evidence. And that relates very directly to the article we read today. Let's continue what he says in the article. He writes, and by the way, we'll include a link to this article on the livingyouth.org page. Oh boy, that reminds me. I wanted to start with something that I messed up with last time. Let me give you an aside to say this. I made, and several people have pointed out to me, I kept saying in our last podcast 87, I think, that the article I was reading from, or we were reading from, was a New York Times article. It was not the New York Times. It was from the Wall Street Journal. If you saw the description on YouTube or you saw the description on Spotify or Apple, you'll see in the printed description that I make a correction there. But I just want to apologize to the Wall Street Journal specifically that I mislabeled your good article. All right, back to his article. So Mr. Weston writes and continues, so that no one misunderstands, we should not have blind faith, as so many in the world have. He says 1 Thessalonians 5:21 admonishes us, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. He highlights we should prove things. We should prove the truth. So he's not talking about having blind faith. He's simply trying to explain that Hebrews 11:1 is not talking about making sure your faith is backed by evidence. He's talking about how faith becomes evidence itself. It's actually a very profound article. Let me jump ahead to also something he says here, because again, this relates to what we're talking about today on the podcast. He says, many atheists sincerely believe there is no God. Muslims sincerely believe truth is found in the Quran. Protestants sincerely believe their form of Protestantism is the religion of the Bible. And Catholics sincerely believe they are the, quote, true church. Believing something and proving something are two different concepts. Many times over the years, when events became difficult, this is him continuing, many times over the years when events became difficult or confusing, I personally went back to review these three pillars of faith. He's about to summarize them. He mentioned them before. I proved to myself then and can still can today that God exists. I proved to myself and still can that the Bible is his word. And when it comes to the true church, I know what the Bible says and cannot deny where God is working based on what it says. It does not matter to me what others believe. I know what I believe and why. So again, he's not talking about not proving things. And he's not talking about the fact that our faith doesn't have evidence to support it, evidence to point to it. So he says, as he says the next sentence, so I am not advocating blind faith. But, he says, Hebrews 11:1 is not talking about evidence-based faith. Notice again what it says. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Yes, faith is the evidence. It's not based on evidence, but is the evidence. Now, again, we have to be, I'd love to read this entire article. Actually, this article alone could have been the entire podcast, but then in the end, we'd just be reading the article because the article is fantastic. Do read it if you have not read this article from 2017. Again, we'll put a link at livingyouth.org. But he is highlighting that fundamentally faith transcends the kinds of things that we are talking about. It's far more than just something backed by evidence. It grows beyond that. And as he said there, it's not a blind faith that he's advocating. Definitely prove things for yourself. Again, keep in mind what it means to prove, like I said earlier. It doesn't mean a mathematical proof. So, I guess I don't want to exaggerate, but I have seen many people who use the fact they can't prove, quote unquote, something sufficiently to just constantly hold off from making a conclusion at all. When the fact is, no, you've got to draw a conclusion, and proof doesn't mean mathematical proof. Take the evidence you have, do due diligence in terms of trying to gather the right evidence, and then draw a conclusion. Again, his point here is that faith is larger than that, and I don't want to shortcut his his article concerning what faith actually is and the more full picture of it. He talks about how faith is forward-looking. He talks about how evidence really isn't enough. We talked about the Israelites already in terms of those who they had fantastic evidence, and yet they didn't build on that evidence into actual living faith, and therefore eventually they did not obey. In his article, Mr. Weston talks about how faith is forward-looking, how it's far more rooted in the idea of a certain trust and a conviction that the things God says will happen. But regardless, it's not a matter of blind faith either. It's not something that's just purely based on evidence. There's more to it than that. On the other hand, it's not something that is just blind faith that evidence opposes. No, evidence can support our faith. But let me just say, for example, in terms of myself, there's a lot of reasons why I believe in God. I might have mentioned this in a previous podcast. If so, I apologize for repeating my story. I've come to find in my old age, I think I repeat almost all of my stories all the time. But one of my favorite apologists, if you will, he's a quote-unquote Christian philosopher, William Lane Craig, is fantastic at what he does in terms of doing debates with atheists about whether God exists or not. And one of his comments in one of his debates I really like because he'll bring multiple arguments to bear. And then someone will ask him, like someone did ask him once, well, if I defeat this argument you have for God's existence, will you admit that God does not exist? And he said, oh no, I've got many arguments As in, it's not like my belief in God rests only in one single argument. It's kind of like saying, hey, if I wanted to prove to you that your mother or father doesn't love you, and I can show you this one thing you think they did because they love you, they didn't do that. They did it because they were in a hurry, or they did it because of this. Would you doubt, you agree that your mother or father don't love you? Well, hopefully you would say, well, no, I've got a lot of reasons that I believe my mom and dad love me, not just the one thing they did on one occasion. Well, that's kind of the sake here. That's kind of the case here. I don't believe in God for just one reason. I have a lot of reasons for believing in God. Some of them involve what I truly do believe to be miracles that I have experienced. A lot of them are just due to certain rational arguments that make the most sense for me. The existence of God makes the most sense based on all the evidence I've seen, the evidence of in creation, the evidence in design, even the evidence in morality, recognizing that it's very clear there is a right and a wrong that is objective in life and in the world. And yet, if there is no God, then no, there is no objective right and wrong. So I have a lot of reasons for believing in God. Well, the part of what I was motivated then in terms of talking about this article for the podcast this week is to talk to you who are listening. That is very specifically our audience of teens and young adults. You are in a very special time in your life when you should be doing that kind of investment in terms of gathering the evidence for yourself, in terms of knowing not just what it is you believe, but why you should believe it. If you're listening to this, it's very likely because, given this is a Living Church of God podcast, it's because you're in the Living Church of God. You have the blessing of being able to actually hear Jesus Christ inspiring ministers to speak to you, inspiring the literature that we have. You have the opportunity to grow up, if you will, even if you're a young adult, you're still growing up, to grow up sitting at the base of the tree of life in a kind of way. That is, you have access to those things. This is the time to invest. This is the time to actually gather that evidence. It's funny. I mentioned earlier that the apostles it'd be a problem for them if faith meant having no evidence. Then the apostles would be in trouble, because I won't turn there for the sake of time here in this podcast, but you can go to things like 2 Peter chapter 1, where he talks about, hey, we're not preaching fables. We literally experienced the resurrected Jesus Christ. Are you saying we saw him in glory when he was transfigured? The tale where he's talking to the vision where he's talking to Moses and Elijah. They're saying we saw that with our own eyes. You can look in 1 John chapter 1, where he says over and over, he says the things that we have seen, that we touched. He was trying to counter a lot of these Gnostic ideas that Jesus was not even real. He was just this kind of this kind of phantasm or spirit. He's saying, no, we literally touched this human being. We saw him with our eyes. We heard him with our ears. They saw that he was resurrected. Well, that was 2,000 years ago or so. You can't gather that kind of evidence in your life now, and yet God has put in the world around us evidence that we can use to help understand that indeed he truly is real. And if you are young, and this is our audience for the podcast, those who are young, this is a very special time of life for you to do the spade work, if you will, to do the digging up and to put that evidence together. Because the time does come when it is far more difficult. In fact, I do want to turn to one verse, at least directly, one passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. We often refer to Ecclesiastes chapter 12 towards the end, where after Solomon has gone through, and in fact, it's not directly related to the podcast today, but I should put a link up to Mr. Rod McNair's sermon on Ecclesiastes. It is just one of the best messages on Ecclesiastes I have ever heard or read. But anyway, he gave this great sermon, Mr. Rod McNair did, about Ecclesiastes, how Solomon was essentially given the opportunity to retain his wisdom, which normally sin corrupts wisdom, because Solomon definitely was sinning, but he was able to retain that wisdom through God's mercy and blessing at his request early in his life, such that he could see the truth of these things and see the emptiness of a life that does not involve God and does not involve obeying God. And able to draw a conclusion at the very end. And this is where we often go to focus. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, and he says in verse 13, he says, reading from the New King James, he says, Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. That is a powerful statement. And he's trying to say, from everything I've experienced, this is what you should focus your whole life on, fearing God and keeping his commandments. Your entire purpose for living, for even existing, is wrapped up in those things. So that said, it's easy just to go to that. But for you, our audience, when it comes to understanding what faith is and the responsibility you have for building and growing faith and founding it, I want to highlight what he says earlier in the same chapter. More of this chapter is meant setting the stage and telling you a message specifically for you youth. If you go back to Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 1, the same chapter, but the beginning of the chapter, he says, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come and the years draw near, when you say, I have no pleasure in them. That is, I have no more pleasure in the days and years in which I live. While the sun and the light, the moon and stars are not darkened, and the clouds do not return after the rain. He goes on, it's very poetic the way that he talks here. Solomon was a good writer. He talks about these difficult times and saying, before the difficult times come, now is the time in your youth to turn towards your Creator, to remember him, and to build that belief and that connection and that relationship, because the times come later when that is so hard to do. And let me just speak from my own experience. Here I am, I'm 53, and I have been given such a blessed life. It is filled with so many opportunities for joy and happiness. And I recognize the life I live is really kind of rare compared to most people on the planet. And also recognize that I cannot take credit for that life, at least not any large kind of credit, because so much of it is due to things I really, in the end, did not have any kind of control over, and I'm so grateful. And yet even the life that I have, in God's mercy, been allowed to live, I recognize life is harder when you get older, when the bones start to creak and the joints start to not want to bend, when next thing you know, you've got appendicitis and you're in a hospital room, or anyway, a lot of difficult things, that you have time and energy to spend in a way you just don't have later. And as you're young right now, you might not think you have it. And in fact, if you're any of our young adults who have children, who are married and have children, you already know how that time starts to slip away. You already know how the crying child who needs to be fed and needs to be taken care of, or even the spouse who has legitimate obligations on your time, how all that starts to slip away. And so I'm not trying to say don't have fun and such, as long as it's godly fun, but I am trying to say that you're in a special time in your life to do the opposite of what this young woman did in terms of understanding faith. Don't stay at that 6-year-old level, because her 6-year-old conclusion that there was no Jesus Christ who rose from the dead, at that level, in terms of the effort that's put into it, is the same as the 6-year-old who believes that Jesus Christ was real and rose from the dead. The difference is her idea then was false. The 6-year-old child who believes in Jesus, at least that idea is true, but it shouldn't stay at that level. That is not a mature, real faith that gets through the hard times. What Solomon is saying is invest in your Creator at the early times of your life, because the times that come later, those are the times you need him. Those are the times when you need to know his reality. Because going back to myself, like I mentioned, I have a lot of arguments that I use to demonstrate God's reality, to demonstrate that God exists, to prove in that way, in terms of the demonstration through evidence, that God is real. I mentioned talking about creation and talking about design and talking about objective morality. I have all of those. But here's the things. when I'm in a time of crisis, when I'm in a time of challenge, when I'm in a time of despair, those aren't the times to wrestle with evidence to see, well, is God real or not? I need to have already done that work. My faith already needs to be something that has had the opportunity to grow larger, because the times happen when the evidence seems different. You look at Israel, man, when they were walking between two giant walls of water, I bet they were filled with a conviction that, wow, God is amazing and God is mighty and God is powerful. But then when the spies were sent out into the promised land, they were confronted with evidence that was challenging to them. Suddenly, giants appear in the land, and they fear having to go up against these giants, and they fear that they would survive in the land. Now, the spies, in fact, Mr. Weston, I think, mentions explicitly this in his article in that Living Church News, which, again, we will link to. You must read it. But he says in that article, the spies had exactly the same evidence across the board. The two who believed God, that is Joshua and Caleb, and all the other spies who did not and who would not go into the promised land. And when you're in a crisis, when you're challenged, and when you're scared, you don't evaluate the evidence in the same way. And what they had not done, the other Israelites who walked through the walls of water, is they had not built on that evidence to the point that they actually transcended the evidence to have faith. Joshua and Caleb did. It was more than just the evidence of the walls of water. They could look at the challenges in the land, and they had the conviction that the same God that did those things was also the God that would see to it that his promises were fulfilled, and they would go into that land safely and would be given that land by God. The others had seen the same evidence, but they didn't do the work with it. They didn't use that evidence to ground something stronger in themselves that they could build on, to the point that it wasn't just an academic matter of knowing God exists, but that he was a God that could be trusted. He was a God that when he said things, even if you didn't have the tangible evidence in your hands that the things he said would come true were going to come true, but your own conviction was enough evidence for you. It has to start somewhere, and your youth is the time to begin. Your youth is that time to begin working hard and gathering that evidence, because I'd like to leave you with two thoughts. The first, God is either real or he is not. That's unavoidable. There's a mathematical thing. Either A, the statement A is true, or it's false. It's one or the other, right? There's no in between. Well, the statement that God exists is either true or it's false. There's a book I had a long time ago, and I like the way it worded it. It said, God is either a fact like sand, or he's fiction like Santa. One or the other. You cannot avoid that fact. God is real or he is not. If he's real, everything is different. If he doesn't exist, frankly, also, everything is different. The entire world is different based on that one question: God is real or he is not. So one, I want to leave you with that thought. You need to embrace that and accept that. But then secondly, I want to challenge you in your youth to take the time to prove that he is real. Take the time to gather the evidence, to talk to the people you need to talk to come to the conclusion that he is real. Not just taking it for granted because you've always believed it, but because you know it is true, because the times will come in your life that will challenge that belief. And it's these times in your youth when you've got the energy to invest in that conclusion, those are the times to lay that kind of foundation where you can begin growing the kind of faith that gets you through those times in the future. Don't let other people, including well-meaning atheists, like in this article, twist the meaning of faith. Living faith is not blind. And at the same time, it is also still more than a purely logical conclusion. It does become evidence itself, but it has to start somewhere. Faith is a forward-looking conviction and trust in and relationship with your Creator. But it starts by proving certain things are true, not simply magically assuming that they are. And when you have done that, you can begin to grow and build a certain kind of faith that becomes its own sort of evidence. And that evidence is the kind of evidence that you fundamentally do want, the evidence that Abraham had and the heroes of faith. Growing that kind of faith is the project of a lifetime, but it starts now in your youth. And it starts by proving those things that are true.
Smith and Robinson.